All right, so let's be real for a second. When we talk about male sexual fantasies, especially ones that men often keep to themselves, there's a certain theme that comes up more than most people expect. It's not always about wild acrobatics or some crazy adventurous scenario. Sometimes it's something deceptively simple, finishing on their partner. Now, I know just saying that out loud makes people react in all kinds of ways. Some uncomfortable, some curious, some intrigued. But instead of shying away from that reaction, we need to lean into it, because that response tells us something about how deep and layered this fantasy actually is. What's important to understand is that this kind of fantasy isn't just about sex. It's not just about a physical act. It's about what that act means. For many men, it's symbolic. It's a moment that feels primal, raw, and incredibly vulnerable. Not just for the woman, but for him too. You see, in that moment, he's not just experiencing pleasure, he's releasing tension, ego, fear, and all the masks he wears in everyday life. It's a rare moment when he can let go, and where that release lands, that moment of visible, almost dramatic finality, says more about what's happening emotionally than we often realize. There's a psychological layer here that's so important to unpack. For some men, finishing on their partner feels like a physical representation of desire. This is how much I want you. This is what you do to me. It's not cold or detached. On the contrary, it can feel intimate, almost like marking a shared moment, not in the possessive or objectifying way some might immediately assume, but in a "you move me to the core" kind of way. It becomes this symbolic gesture that says, "I was overwhelmed by you. My body couldn't hold back because of you." And when the woman receives that, not just physically, but emotionally, it makes a man feel seen in a way that's hard to explain. Now, let me be clear, this isn't about dominance in a disrespectful sense. That's the surface level interpretation. It's more accurate to think of it as an expression of deep craving. A craving to be allowed to lose control in the presence of someone you trust. That's huge for men. So much of male identity, whether we like it or not, is tied up in being in control, in being measured, composed, stoic. But in that one intimate act, all of that crumbles. He's not holding it together. He's not managing the situation. He's not thinking about work or finances or pressure. He's just feeling. And he's allowing you to see that feeling in the most unfiltered, unedited way. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough. The vulnerability of desire from the male side. We're so used to hearing about male desire as something predatory or purely physical. But that's such a shallow lens. Male desire, when it's real and connected, is full of complexity. And sometimes that complexity gets channeled into these moments that, on the surface, seem purely physical but are actually emotionally charged. For example, when a man fantasizes about finishing on his partner, what he may not even consciously realize is that he's picturing a scenario where his desire is met with acceptance. No rejection, no hesitation, just this shared moment where everything about him, his body, his need, his timing, is welcomed. That fantasy becomes less about the visual and more about the experience of being received. And in a world where men are constantly measuring themselves by performance and results, that's a fantasy that goes way beyond sex. It's about approval. It's about being enough. What's ironic is that so many men don't even talk about this. They keep it tucked away, maybe out of shame, maybe because they think it's not romantic enough, or maybe because they're afraid they'll be misunderstood. But if you dig beneath the surface, you'll find that this fantasy is more emotionally loaded than it looks. It's not about treating someone like an object. It's about wanting to be fully known and still accepted. And when that happens in real life, when that trust is built and communication is open, that moment of climax becomes a kind of emotional punctuation mark. It's not just the end of the act. It's a declaration. I trust you enough to give you this part of me. And if that's not intimate, I don't know what is. Because when you strip away the performance, the ego, the fear, what you're left with is someone simply asking, in the only language they know in that moment, can I be this open with you? That's the real fantasy. Let's take a look at where some of these fantasies actually come from. Because they don't just appear out of nowhere. A lot of what men fantasize about, especially when it comes to something like finishing on a partner, is shaped by what they've seen, what they've been taught to associate with pleasure, and how desire has been portrayed to them over time. And you don't have to dig too deep to find one of the biggest influences here, pornography. Now, we can have an honest conversation about porn without making it the villain. The truth is, for a lot of men, porn was their first teacher. Before there were real conversations about sex, before anyone modeled emotional intimacy, porn was the window into what sex looked like, or what it should look like. But the problem is, porn is a performance. It's scripted, exaggerated, and built to deliver a visual payoff. And what's the one thing you'll notice in almost every scene, over and over again? The money shot, the finish. Almost always on the woman, that's not by accident. It's engineered to climax, no pun intended, with a clear, visible sign that something powerful just happened. Over time, that becomes more than just a scene. It becomes a pattern. And patterns shape expectations, especially when they're reinforced again and again. Men grow up not just watching this, but as are absorbing it. Absorbing what sex is supposed to look like. Absorbing the idea that this is what real desire is. That ejaculation on someone isn't just erotic, but necessary for it to be complete, satisfying, or even successful. And that's where things start to get complicated. Because in real life, sex isn't about theatrics. It's about connection. It's about what feels right between two people in that moment. But if a man has been conditioned to associate external release with peak arousal or validation, then his fantasy isn't really about you as a partner. It's about a scene he's been taught to reenact, often without even realizing it. That's not to say it isn't also emotionally loaded. It can be. But what it starts as is a learned script. And it's not just porn. It's culture, too. Think about how often male desire is portrayed in movies, music, and media as this urgent, barely controlled force. It's shown as powerful, raw, and often very physical. Rarely do we see male sexuality portrayed with tenderness, with vulnerability, or with emotional nuance. And so, these fantasies, even the ones that seem superficial, become the way men try to reclaim or assert their desire. Because if you're told your entire life that your worth as a man is tied to how much you want, how much you can take, and how much you can deliver, then suddenly your sexuality becomes a performance, not an expression. So when a man fantasizes about finishing on you, it might feel like it's coming from a deeply personal place, and sometimes it is. But more often than not, it's also layered with years of programming. A blueprint he didn't even know he was following. And here's the kicker. Even if he wants something more meaningful, even if he's craving connection and mutual pleasure, the echo of that conditioning still lingers in the background. It's the muscle memory of visual-based sex. he's been taught to watch sex more than he's been taught to feel it. What we don't often talk about is the quiet insecurity underneath this. Because if sex becomes about performing a role, then anything outside that script, like softness, hesitation, emotional openness, starts to feel wrong, or worse, like failure. And that's why so many men keep these fantasies hidden. Not because they're dark or twisted, but because they don't know how to talk about them without feeling exposed, without feeling like they're revealing just how much influence their early exposure to sex has had on them. And I think that's what makes this whole thing so important to explore. Because it's not just about why the fantasy exists, but about how we create space to unlearn what doesn't serve us anymore. When a man begins to understand the difference between fantasy and reality, when he learns that he doesn't have to follow a script to be desired, that's when real intimacy begins. That's when he stops trying to replicate a scene and starts trying to co-create a moment. And look, this doesn't mean we have to shame the fantasy. It doesn't mean we have to erase it. Fantasies are normal, they're human. And when they're shared with honesty and respect, they can even bring people closer. But if we don't question where our desires come from, if we don't at least get curious about them, then we're just letting old influences drive our most intimate moments. So, if a man tells you his fantasy, or if you sense he has one, but hasn't said it out loud yet, that's not a reason to pull away. It's an opportunity. An invitation to get beneath the surface and ask, what does that actually mean to you? Because sometimes the answer isn't about the act itself. It's about everything he's been told about what it means to be a man. One of the most misunderstood parts of male sexuality is how much of it is actually driven by the need for validation. Not validation in the shallow, ego-boosting sense. Although, sure, that can be part of it sometimes. But something deeper. Something most men would never say out loud, maybe because they haven't even fully realized it themselves. And that's this, behind a lot of male fantasies, including something as specific and often taboo as finishing on a partner, is a quiet, almost aching desire to feel received. We don't usually associate that kind of language with men. We're used to hearing that men want to conquer, to win, to take. But the truth is, there's something incredibly vulnerable about wanting to be welcomed. To have your desire not just tolerated, but embraced. And that's exactly where this fantasy becomes more than just physical. Because in that moment, the moment a man finishes, especially in a way that puts him visibly and literally out in the open, what he's really hoping for is to feel accepted in his rawest state. Now, this is the part no one really talks about. When a man fantasizes about finishing on a partner, especially in a way that's visible, messy, or even a little intense, it's not always about dominance or visual thrill. A lot of the time, it's about this unspoken question. Would you still want me, even at my most unfiltered? Would you still look at me with softness in your eyes, when I've let go completely? When I'm not holding anything back? When I've lost the polished version of myself? That's what's buried inside the act. And for a lot of men, that's an incredibly scary thing to ask for directly, because it's easier to express desire than to express the need to be desired back. It's easier to lean into the physical than it is to risk emotional rejection. So instead of saying, I need to feel wanted, the fantasy becomes a kind of shortcut, an unspoken way to test that. If she lets me do this, if she even wants me to do this, then maybe I really am enough for her. Maybe my desire isn't too much. Maybe I'm not too much. It's this subtle but powerful exchange of acceptance. You receive him, and not just physically. You receive what he's been holding back all day, all week, maybe all his life. And that kind of acceptance is like oxygen for a man who's spent years keeping parts of himself guarded. Because even though we talk a lot about how women want to feel wanted, and rightly so, men do too, desperately. But they've been taught to prove it instead of ask for it, to show strength instead of softness. And because of that, many men use sex, and more specifically, these intense moments of release, as a way to finally be vulnerable without having to say a word. Think about how rare that is. In everyday life, men are expected to lead, to provide, to control their emotions, to stay composed. There's very little space for emotional nakedness. But in the bedroom, in that moment of climax, all of that falls away. That's the one place he doesn't have to have the answers. He doesn't have to fix anything or carry anyone. He just has to be. And if that part of him is welcomed, without shame, without hesitation, then he feels something he probably doesn't feel nearly enough peace. So this fantasy, when you really break it down, is often less about dominance and more about permission. Permission to fall apart a little. Permission to be animalistic, yes, but also to be emotionally exposed. And the act of finishing on someone, especially when it's mutual, when it's communicated, when it's done in a space of trust, becomes more than physical release. It becomes emotional release. It becomes this quiet moment where a man feels seen in his full intensity, and instead of being met with judgment, he's met with openness. And I want to be really clear here. This isn't about reducing anyone to a surface level act or suggesting that every man wants the same thing. People are complex, relationships are nuanced, but if you've ever wondered why something like this lives so vividly in a man's imagination, it's worth asking what kind of emotional story it's telling underneath. Because it's rarely just about sex. It's about affirmation, about a craving to be allowed, fully, unapologetically, and still chosen. And when that happens, when that fantasy isn't just played out but understood, something shifts. The act no longer feels like a performance or a product of cultural conditioning. It becomes personal, intimate, sacred even. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about where he finishes. It's about who receives him and what that moment says about the space they've created together. That's what men are secretly asking for. There's another layer to this fantasy that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's one that makes a lot of people squirm a little because it touches on power. A word that, especially in conversations around sex, can carry a lot of weight. But if we're being honest, power dynamics are everywhere in intimacy, and they're not always dark or dangerous or manipulative. Sometimes they're subtle, sometimes they're mutual, and sometimes they're deeply erotic in ways that are hard to explain, but very easy to feel. When a man fantasizes about finishing on someone, there's often an unspoken power exchange built into that act. Not because he wants to control or demean someone, but because, for a moment, he wants to feel like he can, and that it's wanted. It's about stepping out of the role he plays all day. The one where he's careful, respectful, restrained, and stepping into a space where he doesn't have to hold back. That moment becomes a release not just of physical tension, but of all the unspoken rules and expectations he carries on his shoulders. We live in a world that tells men, whether directly or indirectly, that their power is dangerous, that their desire is something to be managed, softened, even hidden. And while it's absolutely right that power in relationships needs to be approached with care, consent, and self-awareness, we can't ignore the fact that many men have grown up feeling conflicted about their sexual energy. They've been told they're either too much or not enough, too aggressive or too passive. So when a man is with someone who fully consents to receiving him in a way that's bold, unfiltered, and maybe even a little messy, it can feel like a deep exhale, like being given permission to just be powerful without it being dangerous. That's what's really at the core of this kind of fantasy. Not dominance in the cartoonish or disrespectful sense, but a moment of uninhibited masculinity that's welcomed, not feared. And what makes it powerful isn't the act itself. It's that it's consensual, it's shared, it's chosen by both people. That's what flips the dynamic from being about control to being about trust. Because the moment a man feels like he can go there, like he can express that level of intensity without being judged or shut down, is the moment he starts to feel not just aroused, but safe. There's this myth that men are always in control when it comes to sex, that they're the ones leading, initiating, dominating. But what we rarely acknowledge is that for a man to truly express himself sexually, he has to feel an enormous amount of trust, especially when it comes to fantasies like this, because on the surface, it looks like he's the one holding the power. But underneath, that is a vulnerability most people miss. He's not just exposing his body, he's exposing his need to be allowed to take up space. His need to feel that his desire isn't too much or too messy or too intense. And for the woman in that scenario, or for any partner on the receiving end, it's not about being passive. In fact, it's the opposite. Her role in that moment is incredibly powerful too, because she's the one who decides whether to open that door, whether to say, yes, I want all of you, not just the polite, measured version. She's the one giving the green light to a version of him that probably doesn't come out very often. And that kind of permission can be electrifying. Not because one person is dominating the other, but because both people are stepping into a space where they can be more fully themselves. These dynamics, when navigated with respect and communication, can be some of the most intimate experiences we ever have, because they require honesty. They require a willingness to say, this turns me on, even when you're afraid it might sound strange. And they require listening. Not just hearing the fantasy, but understanding the emotional story behind it. The fantasy of finishing on someone may start as a physical desire, but underneath, it's often about the longing to be given space to be primal, to be instinctive, to stop thinking and just feel, and to do all that without guilt. That's a version of power most men don't often get to feel. And when it's received with intention and openness, it doesn't create distance. It creates a deeper bond. Because now, the man isn't just turned on. He feels trusted. He feels understood. He feels like he can bring his full self into the room. Not just the version that's been edited to make everyone else comfortable. And that's what so many men are secretly searching for. Not permission to dominate, but permission to drop the mask, to be intense, to be undone, to feel like their most unfiltered selves are still welcome in the space they share with someone. There's a strange kind of irony in the way men carry their fantasies, especially the ones that feel a little bold, a little taboo, a little too specific to say out loud. Because on the surface, men are often seen as the more sexually open, more assertive, less inhibited ones. But if you dig just a little deeper, what you find is the opposite: a surprising amount of secrecy, shame, and silence. Not because the desires themselves are inherently shameful, but because most men don't feel safe enough to talk about them. And that silence becomes a heavy thing to carry. Take this fantasy we've been talking about. The idea of finishing on a partner. On the surface, it looks like a simple, physical desire. But for many men, even admitting that this turns them on is incredibly vulnerable. Because it's not just about wanting something, it's about the fear of what that desire might say about them. Will she think I'm disrespectful? Will she assume I only care about myself? Will I look crude, immature, or worse, unloving? That's the fear that keeps it locked away. So, instead of opening up about it, most men push it down. They keep it tucked away in the quiet corners of their minds, acting like it's not there, or pretending they don't need to express it. But the truth is, unspoken fantasies don't just disappear. They don't lose their power. In fact, they gain power in silence. And that's where it gets tricky. Because what starts out as a simple desire can grow into a secret need. One that lives in the space between what he wants and what he's afraid to say. And I want to make something clear. The secrecy isn't about being dishonest. It's about protection. A lot of men have never been given the tools to talk about sex in an emotionally safe way. They've never had the kind of conversations that say, hey, it's okay to have desires, even strange ones, even intense ones, as long as they're shared with care and respect. Instead, they've been taught to either act on those desires in private or bury them. And neither of those options leads to real connection. What ends up happening is that a man might bring his body to the relationship, but not his full self. He might be showing up physically, but he's holding back emotionally. And when that happens, you can feel it. You can feel that something's missing, that there's a layer of truth that isn't being touched. That's what secrecy does. It creates distance, not just from the partner, but from the experience itself. Because if you can't be honest in your desire, how can you be fully present in your pleasure? And here's where it gets even more human. A lot of men want to share. They want to be open about their fantasies, even the ones they don't fully understand. But they're scared, not because they think their partner isn't kind or open-minded, but because they fear the fantasy will change the way they're seen. That saying, "This turns me on," will somehow replace the image their partner has of them as respectful, sensitive, loving men. So instead, they stay quiet. They play it safe. And over time, they convince themselves that not speaking is better than risking misunderstanding. But what they don't realize is that keeping those parts of themselves hidden slowly chips away at intimacy. Because true intimacy isn't just about pleasure. It's about honesty. It's about letting someone see who you really are when the lights are off and the roles fall away. And sometimes, who you really are includes desires that are raw, unpredictable, even slightly embarrassing. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. Now, that doesn't mean every fantasy should be acted out. Some things are better left in the realm of imagination. And that's okay. But there's a huge difference between choosing not to act on a fantasy and pretending it doesn't exist. One is mature self-awareness. The other is silent self-denial. And the latter tends to create more disconnection, not less. That's why open communication is everything. Because the moment you say, hey, there's something I've never really said before, and your partner doesn't flinch, doesn't laugh, doesn't shame, that's the moment something shifts in the relationship. Suddenly, you're not hiding anymore. Suddenly, you're both in the same room, fully, honestly. And even if the fantasy doesn't lead to a new experience, their act of sharing it becomes the most intimate part of all. Because what men want, deep down, isn't just to do the thing. It's to feel known. To be able to say, and this is a part of me, and still feel like they're accepted, wanted, chosen. And if we never talk about these things, we rob ourselves of that closeness, of that unique feeling that only comes when both people are brave enough to bring their full, unfiltered selves into the relationship. That's what turns a fantasy from something hidden into something healing. If there's one thing all of this leads us to, everything we've talked about so far, from the psychology behind the fantasy, to the way porn and culture shape it, to the need for validation, vulnerability, and trust, it's this: none of it matters if we're not talking about it. You can have the most nuanced, emotionally charged, layered fantasy in the world, but if it's stuck inside your head, never shared, never explored with the person you're actually connecting with, it just stays there, trapped. And the problem with silence is that it breeds misunderstanding. So many couples walk around thinking they know each other inside and out, but they've never actually sat down and had an honest conversation about desire, about what turns them on, what they fantasize about, what they're afraid to say because they think it'll shift how they're seen. They're physically close, emotionally bonded in some ways, but when it comes to sex, truly honest, vulnerable, desire-driven sex, there's a massive gap, because people are waiting for the other person to bring it up. Or worse, they've already decided the other person wouldn't understand. But here's the thing: fantasy doesn't equal expectation. Just because someone shares a fantasy doesn't mean they need it acted out exactly as described. Sometimes they just want to be heard, understood. They want to take that thing that's been hidden in the back of their mind and put it out into the light and not feel like they've done something wrong by having it. And that kind of honesty takes courage, especially for men who often grow up with the idea that the only safe sexual narrative is a simple one: be strong, perform well, don't complicate things. And the irony is that sex is supposed to be complicated, or at least complex. It's supposed to be layered with nuance and vulnerability and curiosity. It's supposed to be a place where two people learn things about each other that no one else gets to see. But none of that is possible without communication, without consent, without the willingness to say, can we talk about something that's a little awkward, but important? When a man fantasizes about something like finishing on his partner, what matters more than the act itself is the conversation around it. Because within that conversation lies everything that makes sex meaningful: trust, empathy, playfulness, care. And when you open that door, when you create a space where your partner knows they can share something raw without being met with disgust or judgment, you've just deepened the relationship far beyond the physical. And it's not about saying yes to everything. It's not about agreeing to every fantasy or compromising your boundaries just to accommodate someone else. In fact, the most intimate thing you can sometimes say is, I hear you. I respect that you feel that way. That's not something I'm comfortable with, but thank you for trusting me enough to share it. That moment alone, just being witnessed in your desire, is powerful. It's validating. It builds emotional safety. And emotional safety is what allows great sex to happen in the first place. Most people assume consent is just about a yes or no, but real consent, meaningful, enthusiastic consent, is about collaboration. It's about saying, what do we both want to create together in this space? Not, What can I get from you? But what can we explore together that makes us both feel seen? That mindset changes everything. Suddenly, even the most charged fantasies become invitations rather than demands. There's no pressure. There's no script. Just two people choosing how they want to meet each other in the middle. It's interesting, isn't it? Something as specific and intimate as where a man finishes during sex can end up being about so much more than the physical. It can become a reflection of how deeply he trusts his partner, how safe he feels being fully himself, how open the relationship is to honest conversation and curiosity. And when it's met with maturity and presence, it can strengthen the bond in a way few things do. So much of what people are chasing sexually isn't about novelty or kink. It's about freedom. The freedom to express what's been unspoken. The freedom to not have to filter yourself, or water yourself down, or carry shame for being turned on by something. And that freedom only comes from communication, from being willing to look your partner in the eye and say, I want you to know this part of me, and trusting them to hold it with care. Even if it's unfamiliar, even if it's not something they share. At the end of the day, the strongest relationships, the most connected, the most passionate, are the ones where people don't have to guess, where desire isn't a hidden struggle, but an open dialogue. And when a man knows he can bring his truth into that dialogue and be met with understanding, that's when he stops fantasizing in secret and starts experiencing real intimacy in the open.